If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles. See how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. My name is Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and a story editor, and I teach women who are writing in all genres how stories work so they can finish their books faster and without frustration.
And I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor, and poet, and I help writers identify and solve their story problems.
On today's episode, Melanie pitched Black Bag so that we can study turning points. This 2025 film was directed by Steven Soderbergh from a screenplay by David Coep. Of course, there will be spoilers because we can't talk about the story without talking about the story. And as always, we would absolutely love it if you could help other writers find our show. And to do that, all you have to do is leave a rating and or a review. Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Just scroll to the bottom of the landing page, click the 5 stars, and you're done. It's that simple. All right, Melanie, Black Bag. Lay it on me.
Lay it on you, right. Well, we haven't actually talked about this one before the episode, so I don't know what your thoughts are about this. But anyway, this is a fairly new movie, right? So it came out just this year, and I saw it earlier in the cinemas with my family, and I really liked it, especially on the big screen. I thought the music and the atmosphere of the movie was interesting. So and for a couple of other reasons, I chose it, and I'll go into that, into the turning points a little bit later and the subtlety of the turning points a little bit later. But before we discuss them, I just wanted to highlight how good the first scene is in relation to setting up the story. So the first scene is about 4 minutes long. And by the end of the first scene, we know that George is the protagonist. And the inciting incident is that he is given a list of 5 suspects. His object of desire is to find the rat who gave away Cerberus, which is a computer program, that if it's released, it will kill a lot of innocent people. So we have some stakes, and George is enthusiastically George is enthusiastically monogamous and faithful to his wife, Catherine, who is on the list of the 5 names, or in the list with the 5 names. And then George has a week to find the rat. So not only do we have global stakes, but George has personal stakes too. There's internal conflict and external conflict, and there's a ticking time bomb, a mystery, and dramatic irony. So that's a lot to get through in the first 4 minutes of a film, but it actually sets it up really nicely. And so when I saw that and I was thinking about it, I was thinking about some of the things that Valerie and I have talked about many times on the podcast, and about the 4 story questions, setting up who your protagonist is, understanding what the inciting incident is, and how that leads and sets up the rest of the movie. So for 4 minutes in, I thought it was a pretty good example of all of the things that we talk about in the podcast, and also that we've got lessons on in our new school. So anyway, I was enthusiastic about that, and it was really obvious this week. All right, now we're coming up to the end of this season, and I've been reflecting on turning points. And then back in episode 3, when we started the season and we studied the Mighty Ducks, I talked about how obvious the turning points were in that movie. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. But the thing that I really want to highlight is that this week's movie is completely the opposite. There is an enormous amount of subtext and under the surface action going on in this movie. So identifying the turning points is much more difficult compared to a movie like The Mighty Ducks, or even a movie like Mission Impossible, right? Now, I've watched this movie a few times, and the secret this week to working out where the turning points are is understanding George, or understanding what is important to George. And that basically can be summed up by it's his wife, Catherine, right? What's delightful about this is that Catherine appears to be the one person who George will bend his very strict moral code for. And that really comes out in the movie, and it creates quite a lot of conflict, I think, or subtext in the conflict. All right, now I'll just go and think and talk about what's the second. I think it's pretty sure it's the second scene. That is a masterclass in subtext, in my view, and this is where George and Catherine are getting ready for the dinner party. So George has invited 4 people to their home, and these 4, plus his wife Catherine, are the potential rats that he was given on the names that he was given on the list. So George's initial progressive complication is his wife. He has to get an idea of who the traitor is without giving away who he's investigating. And Catherine, obviously, is one of those people. So when Catherine asks, "What are we hunting for this time?" we already know what he is doing and why, but he tells her that they are looking for the person who took Severus. Now, Catherine realizes they are trying to identify who took it and says she thought George would have started with a polygraph. So instantly, her spidey senses are tingling that he is doing something outside of his normal modus operandi, I suppose. Now, Catherine doesn't suspect that she's included in George's list of suspects, but she is familiar with how he operates. And he is going to have fun and games tonight with the dinner guests. And she believes that she is working with him to achieve this goal. Now, what's going on underneath all of this talk is George's conflict of interest. He loves his wife. And Philip pointed out back in the first scene that she is George's blind spot. And during the conversation between George and Catherine, George tells her to avoid eating the chana masala because he's drugged it. And he tells her that he's done this because he wants to remove everyone's inhibitions and start to sense who the liar is. So we can instantly see here that he's already decided to give a little bit of the game away to Catherine. Right, but this is a turning point. So that moment just before George tells Catherine about the meal he's cooked is the turning point of this scene. But it's not obvious. It actually works in the subtext, and you have to pick up what George's internal conflict is to understand why it is the turning point. Because George and Catherine discuss what the dinner is for. Then George watches Catherine put on a pair of earrings that he bought her, and the earrings are actually an external representation of his love for her. He is a fastidious and exact person, but he is extravagant and reckless when he buys her gifts. So there's an instant conflict or complexity in his personality and a weakness when it comes to Catherine. So it's during this conversation before dinner that George's inner conflict is externalized. So George quite clearly doesn't want to drug Catherine, but she is a suspect. So how can he still achieve his aim, which is to try and loosen everybody and get a sense of who the rat could be? Well, this is the beauty of this script, I think. He tells Catherine about the spiked food, but he will still know if she is the rat or get a sense of her being a rat, because if none of the others are liars, then it's more likely that Catherine is the person who's committed this crime within the intelligence community. So it's actually quite interesting in terms of the complexity and the consequences and what we see George doing and what the actual situation is. But in terms of the turning point, it's really quite subtle, and you really have to understand George, I think, to find where a lot of these initial early turning points are. All right, then we move to the dinner, and the dinner party is simmering with tension. There's confessions, and there's even violence. And George's character is revealed further in this dinner party scene via a story that Freddie tells about him. George's contempt and dislike for liars becomes apparent. Now, this scene sets up a great deal of the rest of the movie, so it takes a lot of time to comprehend what's going on. But at face value, it's the scene after the party between George and Catherine that is actually really fascinating. Now, and this is another bedroom scene between these two people. George finds, after the party, George is getting ready. They're getting ready to go to bed, and he finds a movie ticket or a movie ticket stub in the bathroom rubbish bin. Catherine asks George about Severus again, so she seems to know something about it. Then he quizzes Catherine about needing his help. He tells her he'd do anything for her, and she asks him if he'd lie for her, and he says yes, he would, but he would never lie to her. And then she says that she'd only lie to him if she had to. And then she asks him if he'd kill for her, and he says yes. Now, the turning point in this scene is when Catherine asks George if he'd lie for her. And the reason that this is so powerful is because it's very, very clear from the previous scene about what George thinks about liars and what he will do if he thinks someone has lied, not just to him, but just in general. So George's intolerance of liars is really well known, and his love for Catherine is really well known and known amongst their work colleagues. Would he compromise himself for her, even if she wouldn't compromise herself for him? That's a really, really interesting question. And while George gives a definite answer to Catherine, his actions in the next sequence show that he does not trust her. Anyway, in each of these scenes, there's a lot going on, and each of the characters George is investigating reveal things about themselves that complicate the story a little bit later. But I'm going to go on to just the turning point that I love the most in this film. And it's when Freddie tells Catherine that George was watching her via a satellite when he illegally redirected it over Zurich. Catherine, who we've been led to believe could be the rat that George is chasing, has a choice to make. Does she tell George about what Freddie said, or does she meet with Freddie in the morning to work out what they're going to do? But what happens next is really unexpected. They go to bed. So Catherine now knows that George has been watching her and that there's probably a reason why. And she gets into bed next to George. He turns over and George tells Catherine that he believes he's been set up. And then she says that she thinks she has been too. And then this flips the script of the movie. And we think that Catherine could betray George. And we believe that George thinks Catherine is buying Cerberus. But it turns out that they are the target of somebody else's plot. So I really, really love that turning point in the movie because while it's, I wouldn't say it's like a twist, but it kind of twists the understanding of what's going on, and it makes the rest of the movie play out a lot differently to what you'd expect. So technically not a twist, but then if you go back and you get to the end of the movie and you watch some of the actions, particularly of the characters in that dinner scene, it kind of changes your understanding a little bit. But I think that's really the result of a very clever script and an interesting plot. All right. Now, when we get to this point, we realize that what we've seen is actually been a diversion. There is something else going on. And Catherine and George then set up a series of complications for the rest of the suspects plus Stiglitz, who is her boss. So while she's been removed from the pool of 5, there's now an addition that comes in sort of just, well, I'd say about the 3/4 point of the movie. And what they aim to do is to push the other characters into a turning point and crisis via a denouement scene. And then once the guilty party has been identified, they turn and they twist and they really respond in a very obvious way to the actual turning point that Catherine and George have set up. All right. Now, the subtext disappears after George and Catherine realise there's a plan against them. And this makes the progressive complication and turning points easier to identify in the movie. And I really like this contrast. I think there's a lot of complexity in the first part of the movie. And then once you get past that and you understand what's really going on, things change. Now, I did wonder when I was thinking about this if that's good storytelling or not, because it does change things significantly. But I think in the context of the movie and the object of desire, set that up to be good. It's not problematic in the way that it's been problematic in other movies. Anyway, it's just worth thinking about when you're watching it, that the story moves at different paces and there are different techniques applied. And I think that it's worth studying to see that and drill down into what the differences are and understand the options that you have and what you can do with subtext, and then what you do when things are very obvious or you put things very at the feet of the viewer or the reader. Anyway, that's what I've got to say about turning points this week. How did you go, Valerie?
Well, I am less enthusiastic this week. I was watching it and I thought, oh, I bet Melanie loves this movie. Okay. I feel the need to preface what I'm about to say. So here's how I approach a study of a film or a novel or a play or a TV show, whatever it is I'm going to study. The first thing I do is in this case, a film, first thing I do is just watch it. I just watch it. I'm not trying to analyze anything. I'm not taking any notes. I'm just watching it like any other moviegoer. And I'm paying attention to my own reaction. If it's a really good movie, I don't even do that because I'm so wrapped up in the story. It's only when it's over that I have to sort of take a minute or two and think about, oh, wow, that those 2 hours flew by. Or, I was looking at my watch, or I picked up my phone a couple of times, or, so that's my first spidey sense check, I guess, is the best way to put it. And I put a lot of stock in that for a couple of reasons. One, it's kind of just a test of my own personal likes and dislikes. Because a story could be beautifully written and just, be amazing. But it's not like I'm never going to ooh and ah over a war film because I find them very hard to watch. But that's me personally. Okay, that's a personal thing. I'm not going to read a war novel either, but I know, Melanie, it's one of your favorite genres. That's fine. And I do that to kind of sort of make me step out of my comfort zone. So I stretch and I learn and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's the first reason I do it. The second reason I do it is because that's the way people who are not creators of story consume story. Like if you can get someone to read your novel from page 1, like all the way to the last page, once, you get a gold star. You have won being an author. Because that's a big job. Don't even worry about it if someone reads it through a second time. That may or may not ever happen. The goal is just to get them to read it all the way through once and tell their friend about it, right? That's the goal. Same with a movie. Most of us don't watch movies 2 and 3 and 4 or 5 times and analyze them. So that's why I pay attention to my gut reaction, to my spidey sense check on one watch through or read through. So from a purely viewer's perspective, I kind of found it hard to follow. You're right. There is a lot of subtext, a lot of subtext. I watched it with my daughter, as we do so often. And both of us kept asking questions like, wait a minute, who is that now? I mean, there's not a lot of characters, but it was the connection between the characters and, all that kind of stuff. Now, to be fair, when I watched it a second and third time, those types of questions I didn't have because I could pick up on it. And by then, I knew the whole story. So then I was picking up on the subtext. And then here's a good way of putting it. I can appreciate this movie from a craft point of view. But as a viewer, I'm not oohing and awing over it, although it's got really high ratings. So, what do I know? On the first watch through, though, Melanie, if I wasn't doing this for you, I think I would have bailed. I think I would have turned it off just because I was getting confused. And I don't like to feel confused. So I know I'm doing the villain's monologue this season, but for this particular film, knowing it had really high ratings and knowing in my bones that you were going to come in and say you love this movie, I thought a lot about why I had the reaction I did, because I actually genuinely enjoy this type of story. And I've come up with a couple of things that I just want to float past everybody, just for your consideration. I think this movie, Black Bag, is a really great example that writing a story is not a box ticking exercise, because Black Bag does tick a lot of boxes insofar as it does the things that, according to theory, a well-told story does, right? And the things we talk about here on the show all the time. And Melanie, you already mentioned the opening scene and all the boxes it ticks. Now, I was interested in the opening scene. I was, and it sets the stage, and I'm like, okay, well, here's our main character, and here's his mission should he choose to accept it. And all right, and his wife was on the list. That's interesting. So I was interested there, but that interest wasn't sustained. And I think in the case of Black Bag, the two areas that I want to talk about a little bit here, I think it misses the mark on empathy and specificity. So let me deal with specificity first. Yes, in the opening scene, George is given his assignment, and yes, technically the stakes are articulated. Philip says, quote, "If Severus is deployed as intended, thousands of innocent people will die." Okay, so there's two problems with this statement. One, we don't know what Severus is. So it's an abstract idea. We can't, we think in pictures, right? So just saying Severus doesn't connect with anything at all. We don't know what Severus is in this world. Instantly, I thought of Severus Snape, which clearly is not anything to do with this. But the word Severus, it's not tethered to anything in the story world, so it has no meaning for us. The second problem is that phrase, thousands of innocent people will die. We can't connect with thousands of innocent people. Like, the bigger your story idea, the more specific the example in your story should be. So if you think back to, now I think it was the movie Eye in the Sky that we did in season 11. I was going back through the notes and I couldn't find the specific reference, but Melanie, correct me if I'm wrong. In that movie, there was a bomb that was going to be dropped to sort of get the bad guy, right? In his bunker, in his house, where all him and all his henchmen were. And just as they're going to drop the bomb, a little girl sets up a table. She walks into the bomb zone, which also happens to be close to the marketplace on a main area. She sets up a table and starts selling bread for her money, to get money for her family. And these are poor people. Now that little girl, I remember watching that and feeling very stressed because I didn't want any harm to come to that little girl who had been set up so well earlier in the movie. That little girl represents the, quote, thousands of innocent people. So we can connect with the little girl emotionally, but we don't have any emotional connection to thousands of innocent people. Now, it turns out that Severus is a code, and the code somehow was manually or physically delivered to the bad guys who are dissident Russians, because we see early in the movie this device in James's hands, and it's a red football keychain that doubles as some kind of jump drive, right? And then we see that same red football melting in the flames when the Russians' car is on fire. So I thought to myself, if it's a code, why did it have to be delivered manually? Like, I know it's a film and this is a visual device, but this is the type of story. It's a left brain story. So you are inviting your audience to be thinking critically all of the time. And I love that sort of stuff. So I instantly went to, if it's a code, why couldn't it be sent digitally across the interwebs somehow? Why, other than that it's a visual device and film is a visual medium, why that? So that sort of took me out of the story a little bit. Now, the other thing that you mentioned about the opening scene is that there are stakes sort of globally, right? These thousands of innocent people will die, but there's also personal stakes to George. I think those are far more interesting because it's specific. It's his wife. That is the stake that I engaged to when I saw the first time. I thought, ooh, because it's also the hook, right? Ooh, his wife is on the list. Well, now this gets interesting. So the seeds of empathy are planted there, 100%, 100%. I just don't think that it carried on very well. I think as the story went on, George's crisis, like that crisis that we were presented with in the opening scene, I think it becomes diluted when we see that, he's like a human lie detector, right? When we see that it's a lovely character dimension, he will not tolerate anyone lying, yet he will become a liar. That's a lovely character dimension. But when we see that he's actually telling the truth there, that takes away any of the questions about the wife being on the list. Like, we know his loyalty is to her, even over his country. Anyway, empathy is different than sympathy. We say that all the time. I empathized with George initially, and then my empathy waned very quickly. I didn't sympathize with George or anybody else in the story because none of these characters are particularly likable, and that's okay. That's not a failing in the story at all. But as the audience, our empathy with George has to be established very quickly, which it is, but it also has to be sustained throughout the story so that once we know that he's not going to betray Catherine, even if she is the traitor, another stake has to come in really quickly. The question for me then was, all right, well, what does that mean? What does that mean for them if she is the traitor? What does that mean for them if they are both being set up? And that's kind of, it just didn't land for me. Like I said, technically, boxes are being ticked. But in the end, when all is revealed, like you said, Melanie, in that huge, massive denouement scene, I went, yeah, okay. Like there was no emotional there, no emotional connection there at all. And that was the thing that amazed me most at the end. I wasn't emotionally engaged, neither was I intellectually curious by the end of the movie. So if I went back and I did a a real detailed analysis, I could probably figure out exactly where that happened and exactly why that happened. But none of that is my topic for the season. So I better spend a minute talking about the villain's monologue. There is one, and it is obvious. And I'm telling you, these things jump right out at you when you know them. Did it jump out to you, Melanie, when you were watching the movie?
Yes, it did. But then, I can't, and even though, you and I study our own different areas, you can't help as we're going along picking up what each other are learning. So yes, yes, I did.
It's almost like there's a neon sign, villain's monologue, villain's monologue, villain's monologue.
Villain approaching, villain approaching.
Exactly. There's a lovely in and out for this film. Like, it starts with this big dinner scene and it also ends at the dinner table. This is at 1 hour and 20 minutes into the movie. And all the key suspects are once again gathered at the home of George and Catherine around their dining table. Now, none of these people are who they seem to be, which is interesting. None of them are likable. That's also perfectly fine. I personally didn't empathize with any of the characters. That's okay if you don't empathize with any of the other characters, but you must empathize with the protagonist because that's the avatar. That's your representative in the story. Now, part of the problem, Melanie, is I think they ran out of time. This is a short movie. It's only 90 minutes and there's 7 characters to develop. So I think that might have been one of the contributing factors here. They just ran out of runway. And that is why there's so much exposition in this movie, because holy macaroni, there's a lot of exposition and subtext. So it kind of goes back and forth between exposition and subtext. So it's either barely telling you anything at all or blatantly telling you everything. So that was interesting. It's an interesting study on dialogue, this film. All right. Anyway, back to the dinner table. George and Catherine say that they're going to play a game with these other 4 remaining suspects because we know by this point that Catherine is not a suspect. So in the game, these are the rules of the game. George is going to ask everyone a question. And if they answer the question wrong, they lose and the loser is going to get shot. So we've got, other than George and Catherine, we've got Dr. Vaughn, Freddie, Clarissa, and James. So Clarissa is ruled out right away. She is innocent. Dr. Vaughn and Freddie, we are told that they discovered George is the one who had the satellite redirected, and they told Catherine so she would be able to cover for him. Great. None of that has to do with the main storyline, which is who's the mole, for lack of a better phrase, like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, looking for the mole in the circus. So what George is looking for, this was his mission in the opening scene. He's looking for the traitor who gave Severus to the Russians, right? To the defected Russians. And we find out that the villain is James Stokes in association with the boss, Arthur Stiglitz. Now, when George calls him out, at first he denies it, which is fine, but then he launches into the monologue. So here's what James says. Severus was a good plan. I'd do it again 10 times out of 10. It was a decent frame and it would have ended the war. And he's talking about the war between Russia and Ukraine. He says, it was right, it was brave, and it was noble. George then says, which one was the reason you killed Meacham? Because he also killed one of the handlers, right? The guy in the opening scene who gave George his mission in the first place. And James says, because it was necessary. Come on, George. You take me out in handcuffs. You say your bit. I'll say my bit. And then what? You'll still go down. You've got nothing hard. You've got suspicions, hearsay, and pillow talk. So we know why James did what he did. He wanted to end the war between Russia and Ukraine, and he says it was a good job. So that's the villain's monologue. But something that confused me here is that James says Severus is a good plan, not a code, right? So the idea is he wanted to give it to the dissident Russians to cause nuclear meltdown in Russia and in the war. And that is the thing that would have killed thousands of innocent Russian civilians, right? These are the innocent people mentioned at the beginning in the opening scene. All right, Melanie, what's the action step for today? Are we still friends?
Well, no, we're still friends. That's okay. Well, and it's different, isn't it? So because you and I have different tastes, there's things that overlap, but we do have different tastes. And I love a good spy story. But so one of the interesting things about this for me is that this has actually happened in real life. So during the Obama administration, they broke code that got put into Iranian nuclear reactors and caused a meltdown. And so this has actually really happened. And so this is something that I find really fascinating about this whole code, and that they do it again and those sorts of things. So the stakes in this for me have been realized. And I find all of this sort of stuff uber fascinating. And the interesting thing about the code is that it leaves a digital footprint. So when you ask the question of why wouldn't they send it electronically, it's because it can be tracked electronically as it moves, even if it goes through darker sources and darker places on the internet. So anyway, it's a bit, that's me nerding out, right?
So was that explained in the movie?
Me nerding out. It's not. It's implied that you would know. No, it's not. It's like,
wow.
And so when you were talking about it, I realized it's the same for me with the movies that you really like that I'm probably not as into. There's things that I don't understand as not an avid follower of those genres. And I realized when you were talking about that, it's like, so as this person who's, into spy movies and a few other things, there's stuff that I have they've assumed knowledge for the audience. But if you're not a follower, you would not have that assumed knowledge. So it's not explained, but I suppose if you like these types of movies, it'd be something that you would kind of understand. So there's an assumption.
I think with all the exposition that they put in this movie, they could have thrown in a line that said it's a digital footprint. Then I would have went, oh, okay, that makes sense. Oh, well. Anyway, what's the action step for
the action step? Sorry, yes, I'll get bring me back on track. Good point. All right, sorry, I go off. All right, today's action step is understanding a character's motivation is key to creating turning points. George hates liars but loves his wife, and he's constantly challenged to consider if his wife is a liar. So, I want you to check your turning points and make sure that they place your characters in a position where they have to make a choice that creates inner conflict.
And that wraps it up for this week and this season. And we got out of the season still as friends. Woohoo! Join us again next week for our best advice episode, where we wrap up our aha moments and lessons learned about turning points and the villain's monologue. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For more information about our online training, visit storynerd.ca/courses. To join my inner circle, go to valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle. And for books to help you read like a writer, visit Melanie at melaniehill.au. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun. And don't lose your friends over a movie.